All right, thank you very much. Nice to be back here, my second time in a row attending this conference. And my goal in this paper is to show how the post-2020 state has sort of provided a stifling legal framework around the interpretations of the Great Patriotic War that take us further and further away from objectivity and in-depth research. The focus is history, but for political ends. And the consequence has been observed fabrications and distortions on its scale, unmatched even by the parallel campaign taking place in Moscow. So the questions I'm asking is this campaign significant? Are Belarusians likely to be convinced by this revisionism of the past? Will it eradicate the memory of the 2020 awakening? What does it mean for the study of history as a discipline? Alexander Lukashenko has been in power now for almost 31 years. A remarkable statistic when one considers the turbulent period of 1994 to 2025, sanctions placed on the regime by the EU, UK, Canada, and the United States, and the disputes with Russia over oil prices, and not least the anti-government uprising of 2020, of hundreds and thousands of protesters after the flawed elections. One way he's done this has been to try to extricate himself from isolation at home and abroad by manipulating history for political purposes. He observed in 2020 that the teaching of history in schools focused on Belarusian lands in the period of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as the main experience to build a modern state after 1991, and believe that more focus should be placed on Soviet achievements and Belarus as a victim and victor of the Great Patriotic War. He's come up with a concept of, quote, the genocide of the Belarusian people. It's not a new concept. It's attracted academic interest and has been explored by numerous scholars, and I won't mention their names here, but I have done in the article that I've written. Most recently, in an excellent article by Gundula Pol in the Journal of Genocide Studies, that takes as its starting point the March 2024 trial of Vladimir Katryuk, a Canadian citizen of Ukrainian background, by the Supreme Court of Belarus. And that he was found guilty in this trial is not a surprise. What is perhaps more surprising is that he died 10 years before the trial took place. Gundula Pol points out that the earliest manifestation of the theory of genocide of Belarusians was a 2009 article in the state-sponsored Belaruskaya Dumka by Alei Liskevich, making the claim that Belarusians and Jews suffered equally during the war. But the Belarusian investigation has not taken a scholarly approach. The main researcher is a lawyer, no disrespect, Yari, without any historical training, Alexander Shved, the chief prosecutor of Belarus. His approach started from this slogan, the genocide of the Belarusian people in the Great Patriotic War, which has been codified into law, and the denial of which could result initially in a prison sentence of up to 5 years. How did this begin? On the January the 5th, 2022, the Belarusian government issued a decree on the genocide of the Belarusian nation that focused on crimes carried out during the war and up to 1951 on the territory of the BSSR. It demanded the punishment of Nazis and their accomplices, as well as individuals who in public statements, this is a quote now, public statements, academic and journalistic publications, and in social media deny the fact that the Belarusian nation was subject to genocide. The current campaign began really in spring 2021 with a media and social media campaign on the same topic, mostly directed against the Poles and what it termed Poland's accursed soldiers, without mentioning specifically the Polish Home Army. And for some time, Lukashenko has targeted the Union of Poles in Belarus and arrested its leaders, such as Angelika Borys and Andrzej Pochabut, who were accused of inciting crimes based on ethnicity. Linked to this same target, on June 7, 2021, Presidential Decree 206 inaugurated a new holiday, a day of national unity, on September the 17th, marking the infamous occasion when the Soviet army invaded Poland on the basis of the Nazi-Soviet Pact and reunited both Belarusian and Ukrainian territories with their Soviet republics. So in other words, they established a national holiday on the day of the fourth partition of Poland, not something likely to endear them to the government in Warsaw. The genocide campaign was perhaps prompted by a speech of the late Foreign Minister Władimir Mackay on 9th of March 2021 about Polish language classes in the Brest region that celebrated the Day of the Damned Soldiers, honoring the Polish Home Army fighters in their struggle against the Nazis and the Red Army. And Mackay declared that such classes represented glorification of war criminals. A month later, Szwed opened a criminal case claiming that his office had uncovered information about, quote, living Nazi criminals who were members of the Polish Home Army and Lithuanian SS battalions. On June the 2nd, Szwed's office requested that Lithuania extradite former President Valdas Adamkus for an investigation into a wartime case in which he was incriminated. Needless to say, the Lithuanians did not respond to that request. In terms of rewriting history, on March 16, 2021, the number of war losses in the Belarusian Republic, according to Szwed, was said to be 3 million, adding 800,000 or a million onto earlier estimates without any clarification or cited sources. On the same day, he claimed his office had interviewed over 13,500 witnesses to these crimes. And just a year later, he published a widely circulated book entitled The Genocide of the Belarusian People that was regarded as the definitive verdict on the subject. Remarkably, the authorities claimed to have discovered numerous previously unknown facts about the extermination of the Belarusian people. One report from Brest region maintains that at least 546,000 people were killed at the Trasianets death camp east of Minsk, whereas on the signs at that camp and other information and previously cited publications, the death toll is estimated at 205,000. Suddenly, it's gone up to 546,000. So how can one account for the sudden addition of over 300 deaths, which are presumably part of the additional 800,000 war victims overall? In March 2022, Szwed announced the discovery of 117 mass graves in a speech to journalists at the Hatyn Memorial site. And he claimed that only 10% of the information about the scale of the tragedy had been uncovered so far. The number of living witnesses had now reached 13,000, of whom 500 were on a list to be questioned in 2023, and many of these people lived in bordering countries of Belarus. Szwed also added to the hyperbole surrounding the investigations in March 2025 with the information that the number of death camps in Belarus has now risen to 587, and the number of villages destroyed by the occupants, there's a well-known figure that this is 9,200. That's obviously wrong because it is now 12,300. So a further 3,100 settlements have suddenly been discovered to have been burned to the ground during the Nazi occupation period. The question is whether the Nazis and their collaborators, such as SS battalions and auxiliary police, have the same malevolence toward the Belarusians that they had, for example, toward the Jewish population. Many historians disagree. Alexander Paskevich, for example, comments that if we talk about the Second World War, then during it, there were only two peoples who were consciously and mercilessly physically exterminated for the sole reason of belonging to them, namely Jews and gypsies. Israeli Belarusian historian Leonid Smilovitsky, author of the most thorough book on the history of the Holocaust in Belarus, puts it even more succinctly. The most important thing we must remember is that Belarusians were never exterminated for being Belarusians. Jews were exterminated, every single one, absolutely everywhere. When a Jew was captured, he was condemned. No intercession could save him. That's the main difference. The pro-Russian link in this propaganda is quite evident. Political scientist Kamil Lisinski notes that the regime has stressed Russia's role in the history of Belarus, thus abandoning the policy of soft Belarusianization that had been adopted in 2014. Lukashenko has increasingly included the word genocide in his speeches. Some scholars maintain that the practice does not merit serious analysis. Tatiana Ostrovskaya questions why one should examine statements that constitute serious manipulations of history. And she perceives that there are two goals to the propaganda campaign. First, to present the West as a threat to Belarus, and second, to unify the nation. And her comments are added to by those of Alexei Lastowski, who maintains that over time the war became the main source of Lukashenko's legitimacy, particularly after his flagrant abuse of the 1994 constitution to maintain himself in office. Also, those who criticize him today are depicted as Nazis or fascists. The notion of this wider genocide, however, did begin in Russia and can be linked in particular to the work of the prolific propagandist Alexander Dukov, who might be described as Putin's court historian. Paskevich asks, and it's a good question, how is it possible that such witnesses are found 80 years after the end of the war? And if there are such fighters for historical truth, then what has been happening in the previous 30 years when Lukashenko was in power? Why were these 12,500 or 13,000 witnesses not discovered 20 years ago when there were so many more eyewitnesses to the war that were still living? So these events, and in particular the emphasis on a definitive version of history that cannot be questioned, raise serious questions about the discipline of history in Belarus, in Russia. In this respect, we are not talking about history based on archives, records, testimonies, and the like, or an attempt to ascertain historical accuracy. Rather, history is used for a direct purpose and as a guide to future state policy. In Belarus, it has been reduced to propaganda, half-truths, and fabrications that make it unlikely that one can regard the Second World War as a suitable project for research today. And just to give one example of one of the early cases of a trial of a citizen rash enough to deny the concept of the genocide of the Belarusians, a 55-year-old plasterer living in Minsk, Andrei Savitsky, who was stopped for a traffic violation but managed to insult Lukashenko in social media in 2020, blamed the Hatyn massacre on the actions of the partisans. It is alleged that he lied not only to his interrogators, but also to his family, that he liked to drink, quote unquote, and he received a 3-year prison sentence in a penal colony as a result. And the article about his case in the presidential newspaper concluded, you have to be a very stupid person to claim anything different today, given the huge amount of reliable materials, including criminal case materials, historical facts, archive materials, and military tribunals. It means that falsification, denial of genocide, and attempt to whitewash the punishers was done intentionally and all for a reason. So it seems that the more public pronouncements there are, the more convincing the case. And I'll conclude by just making 2 points before Andrew gives me the 5-minute signal. The first is that the official Belarusian state apparatus has effectively negated the story of the Jewish Holocaust. There are only a few thousand Jews remaining in Belarus today, in contrast to the pre-war period, and almost no Jewish local historians to contradict this new version of the war. The second is that after 2020, the Lukashenko regime was isolated by the European Union and has looked for ways to rehabilitate and legitimize itself. The moral high ground of a war against the Nazis and the reopening of the period to new investigations transforms the period 1941 to 45 to the present. Collaborators are equated with the 2020 opposition, with Baltic nationalists or the Polish Home Army. Even the opposition greeting and the regular Belarusian greeting, Żywe Belarus, was banned by the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 2022 and considered the equivalent of the Nazi salutation, Heil Hitler. The whole period or picture is one of a victimized Belarus tied to Russia, fighting against the weight of a disreputable West that has targeted the country and its leaders. So, in the words of Valery Kabalevich, Putin and Lukashenko do not hide at the solemn celebration of the 80th anniversary of the Great Victory. And you see how contemporary this is. I timed my talk just for today. It couldn't have taken place any other day. Is needed not so much to honor the victors, but to solve the current political tasks facing the Belarusian and Russian regimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I have many questions, but I'll keep them till the end. Our second speaker is Dr. Vital Biel, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, the Rheinisch Friedrich Wilhelm University of Bonn. His current research project is Race and Freedom, Africans in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on the Eve of Modernity. But he'll be talking today on the title Oppressed Oppressors, Reconsidering Belarusian Involvement in Colonialism. Dr. Biel.
Hello to everyone.
Hello.
Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, please proceed.
Great. Hello to everyone. Great to be with you again, even in this virtual way. Today, I would like not to present some authentic new discoveries or some unknown things, but it's rather an attempt to raise a different perspective to mostly known facts and to set some questions for reflection. I see that my presentation will interplay in some different way with some previous papers that were already in previous panel. So I would like to remind that Belarusians have long imagined themselves as a nation shaped by different oppression and colonialism. But it is even a joke that the history of Belarus is a history of hunt written by a rabbit. Against this background, it can be confusing or even shocking to read headlines from Zimbabwe, as we see here, where civil society denounced Belarusian colonialism. But that is really the case, and the Belarusian regime indeed joins this new cynical scramble for Africa. These political events raise unexpected and unsettling questions for scholars as well. Can people who are oppressed and colonized also at the same time act as colonizers and oppressors? Has Belarus engaged in colonization historically or maybe even today? And should we acknowledge this paradox in our Belarusian national memory and public discourse, and how, in which way? Actually, despite the extensive scholarship on imperialism and colonialism, There are still lack of established approach to the situations where society oppressed or dominated by a large imperial force nonetheless participates in the oppression or colonization of others. There are different terms used, but none of them really describes the situation of Belarusians. To maybe refer you, especially international audience, think of the Irish or Scottish under the British Empire, who were themselves subjects of English dominance and second-class subjects at home, but yet played active roles in British overseas colonization, where they could form even elites. In the time of the first stage of global European expansion, to say in Immanuel Wallenstein's terminology, Poland-Lithuania, that we consider our previous state, was a semi-peripheral society, so it was virtually blocked from political expansion beyond its original sphere, and it had only indirect access to the economic gains from European colonization. However, to focus on these possible but still significant options, it was mediated economic activity and migration that took place both in the Western European and Russian colonial projects. Since the early days of European colonialism, Belarusian lands acted as suppliers of raw materials for overseas expansion of other states, and at the same time, Belarus and Poland-Lithuania generally became important markets for imports, which were explicitly called colonial goods, well into the 20th century. There was another level of colonial participation, less visible but significant, as it was already mentioned today, the personal one. Here it is possible to define two major periods of such personal participation or such migration. Before the mid-19th century, a time of individual ventures and late 19th to late 20th century, a time of mass movements. Belarusians and their perceived ancestors were luckily, for the historical context, white and Christian. This gave them the access to participation alongside and often on similar terms as other Europeans from the colonial metropolis. Colonial powers, both Russia and the Western European empires, needed manpower to conquer, administer, and maintain their possessions. So this migration was also a commodity supply. So these countries were often open to evolving migrants, but of course primarily white and Christian. Thus, people from Belarusian lands engaged in almost all colonial projects. In the 17th century, Dutch service was the most popular. In the 18th, 19th century, the French one. Since the second half of the 19th century, people from Belarus, including Jews, but not only, joined large numbers of migrant flows across the Atlantic Ocean to North and South America, Australia, South Africa, not only to developed industrial centers, but also to various frontiers. However, the most important direction was the east, the Russian colonial project across these vast lands of North Eurasia, both in Tsarist, imperial, and Soviet forms. How should we, Belarusians, ethically understand Belarusian involvement in colonialism? Is it true that there were no Belarusian national governments at the time that imposed colonial policies or directed expansion? However, Belarusians, or the ancestors, often acted as agents implementing the colonial policies of the larger imperial governments they served. They also took part in voluntaristic activities across loosely controlled territories and frontiers for private gains. As a clear example, is the participation of Belarusians in the 17th century conquest of Siberia. So-called Lithuanians, Litva or Belarusцы, comprised sometimes up to a quarter of the Russian military there, engaging in subjugation, predatory extraction of furs from indigenous people, enslavement, hostage-taking, pillaging, robberies, similar to the infamous conquistadores of the New World. These examples, for the lack of time, is just a surface scratch of Belarusian entanglements in imperial colonial violence, but no dedicated studies have specifically examined this involvement. What Belarusians gained from this colonial participation? It is widely accepted that for colonial powers, the exploitation of controlled territories brought enormous profits and often laid the foundation for long-term economic prosperity. However, the profits from colonial expansion were never distributed equally. In the case of Belarusian lands, especially during the first stage of colonial participation, the main gains came from economic trade with colonial markets, like grain and forestry products, brought wealth to magnates and the generally landed gentry, but very few for merchant class, because it was mostly under control of Dutch merchants, other international merchants. And we could say that the Baroque splendors in the places like Nesvizh Castle in my native town was partly raised on this colonial trade. However, these wealth also helped sustain the manorial system and serve them, relying on unpaid and underpaid labor. Capitals were exchanged mostly for import of luxurious goods, especially colonial goods, ranging from coffee, tobacco, to even black slaves as the court Moors. In both stages of colonialism, the personal migration of Belarusians was a risky enterprise. Some adventurous individuals did manage to enrich themselves, but many just perished or failed. Even those who prospered usually had no impact on their home society, as they rarely returned with capital or reinvested in their homeland. This pattern began to change somewhat in the 20th century, when infrastructure for capital transfer improved. Still, across broader historical picture, this individual colonialism mostly drained people away from Belarus, who then dissolved among broader white colonial population, often without creating a lasting Belarusian diaspora. So probably gains for these successful individuals, but not for their society from Belarus. The Soviet stage of colonialism had the most profound influence on Belarus. On the personal level, it involved hundreds of thousands of Belarusians in large-scale projects in the east and south. It started with the extraction of forced labor of Belarusian prisoners and special settlers, spецпоселенцы. But especially after the Second World War, it opened numerous opportunities. Infrastructure development expanded, allowing Belarusians to work permanently or in shifts in wealthy Siberian or Central Asian industrial, mining, or agrarian regions, and they could return home and somehow invest their earnings, as it was possible, at least in private property within the socialist system, but that was still limiting this investment. However, this Belarusian metropolis or sub-metropolis also benefited from this wealth extraction in the east. In fact, post-war development of the Belarusian Soviet Republic was to a significant extent related to it, as we had before, but we can re-evaluate it from this perspective. Belarusian participation in the resource extraction and transit fueled its rapid industrialization in the 60s, 70s especially. In Belarus, we know that Belarus became a sort of assembly workshop within Soviet economy, but part of this assembly worked especially for this eastern extraction, for mining operations in Russia, dependent territories like Belarus tracts, or proceeding raw materials from other parts like cotton from Central Asia in Baranovichi. Belarus also greatly profited and still profits nowadays from the transit and refining of crude oil extracted from places like Komi Republic, Bashkortostan, Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug, and from natural gas pipelines. So even nowadays, the economy of Belarus, to a certain extent, sustains the same sub-imperial patterns and it's a significant share of Belarusian economy until nowadays. How it happened? Generally, it is worth reflecting on how Belarus' privileged participation in the Russian colonial project contributed to Belarusian Russification and the long-term consolidation of Soviet Belarus identity around the Russian state and ideology. In the imperial period, locals of northeastern Krai might have faced religious discrimination or class barriers at home, but in the colonial context, these hierarchies shifted, opening new social and economic opportunities, including becoming part of the privileged Russian colonial class in these non-Russian peripheries. And this pattern persisted into Soviet times. The official image of the Brotherhood of Peoples typically placed Russians at the top, you see at these posters, followed closely by Belarusians and Ukrainians, a visual and symbolic hierarchy that reinforced Belarus's sense of proximity to the imperial center. Could it be that this historically privileged position, contrasted with the status of non-Russians, helped secure Belarus's deep-rooted alignment with Russian imperial structures, and probably do it until now? What strikes me most is the almost complete lack of reflection of Belarusian participation in colonial systems. It's not that these historical phenomena are not entirely unknown, but that are rarely framed or considered in this way. Instead, they may be seen as a part of Polish, Russian, or other endeavors, or even positivistically celebrated from this Eurocentric perspective as a participation in great geographic discoveries or development of Siberia, or some episodes like the colonies of Kurland or African trafficking of slaves to Belarus are uncritically appropriated as exotic, curious episodes, sometimes even with some strange pride. And why it is still matter to reflect on Belarusian colonialism? Well, of course, first to avoid this neo-colonialism in the present and future that we see in Zimbabwe case, because its gains came to corrupted elites and costs will be on the Belarusian people. Also, it is important to understand the roots and costs of resource dependence we have now. It's not just some normal trade, it's really a participation in this unequal resource extraction from other people to really came to mind to Belarusians. Also, it is a way to critically examine the very return to Europe narrative of our democratic society. The idea of Belarus return to Europe has long been a powerful tool in the struggle against authoritarianism and still is, but in its idealized form, it often ignores uncomfortable truths that Belarusian intellectuals speak about our Europeanness, but rarely reflect on the negative legacies embedded in this history. And it is related to the idea to confront rising racism and xenophobia that were really dominant in Belarusian society. So that faces growing racism, growing globalization and migration, causing such funny sometimes moral panics as the one with Pakistanis coming to Belarus. Who knows these developments? So, armed with this myth of colonial innocence, the belief that Belarus has no colonial parts or guilt, many Belarusians view migrants from global south as unrelated to Belarusian history and therefore as illegitimate outsiders. And often among the Belarusians are often among the most aggressive opponents of such colonial movements like Black Lives Matter or something like this. So to understand and imagine Belarus' true place in the contemporary global world, we really need serious reflection on Belarus's global historical roles, both as a victim and as a participant of building this global injustice. Thank you. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vital. Our third speaker is Siarhei Marozau, an independent researcher based in Poland. And Siarhei will talk on the Kremlin shadow over the history and Belarusian Memory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, 2022 to 2024. So, hey, please.
Online. There is a Siarhei, but
Do you hear me? Excuse me, please, but Siarhei Marozau must receive, must no, say that he will be later, and I ask to present my paper, and then he will be, because he is working on the factory and at the factory, and he will be at 14:25. Not yes, on 14:25 he will be. Can I
Which time?
present my paper now?
Yes, so we're very happy for you to go ahead, but
introduce yourself.
that would be outside of this session, would it?
No, I think she's still the last speaker on the panel. So Sviatlana is the last speaker, right?
Sure, but if Siarhei is late, he will have to
We'll
pay
see,
into another
we'll see later. But and Sviatlana, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, so please go ahead and deliver your paper.
Moment. Moment. Okay.
It's
My presentation. This is my presentation to share. Do you see my presentation on the screen? Yes? Okay. Okay, excellent.
Sviatlana is actually based in Belarus, although I'm not sure. You may want to ask.
The title of my presentation, my paper is Scientific Priorities of Official Belarusian Historiography after 2020 in the Study of National History. Belarusian, I will speak about Belarusian historians at first, and then about historians in Belarus. Today it is two different, two various terms. So, community of Belarusian historians since the fall of 2020, there have been large personal losses in the community of Belarusian historians. Layoff continued until recently. This weakening the potential of historical science. I want to say about Institute of History of National Academy of Science. Many historians were fired, or they fired themselves. Some of them relocated to Poland or Lithuania. And when at the end of 2023, there was a revision of Belarusian Science and Institute of History, Institute received note that its scientific potential degrees, historians with scientific degrees and levels, very low. So at the beginning of 2024, Institute such historians, such personal and as my colleagues said, they invited to work at institute masters because there were no. They cannot find historians that they can take to to the job. Why? It was necessary to receive characteristics from previous place of work. And director of Institute of History say that we have some we received some applications, but we cannot from historians, but we cannot take to work in institute anybody because they have not allowance of special know how to say officer from KDB who check these characteristics. And I was fired not far before this, and I also was rejected by Institute of History, though it was necessary personal for him. Then the next characteristics, a clear differentiation in the workshop of historians and in the interpretation of the past. Two groups of historians appeared. Free historical Belarusian thought moved abroad or fell silent in the country. Although sometime until 2023, authorial or collective works prepared in the previous period, can, let's say, of relative liberalization in the field of historical creativity, these works were published later. A number of historians still publish their work at their own expense in non-state printing houses. In these works, they cautiously and validly cite facts and present ideas that official science has already banned. Now about conditions in which historians work in Belarus, historians that left in Belarus. Historians who remained in institutions work in different, in difficult conditions, predetermined by the authorities. What are these conditions? The list of conditions are here on the screen. Idealizing and policing historical science, all sorts of complaints and restrictions, list of topics for research, control by the Council for Historical Policy, created list of extremist materials. Here I wrote historian Zahar Shebeka in breaks. His book, History of Belarus in 1795, 2002, published in Belarus in 2003, in 24th years was announced as extremist material. Zahar Shebeka, how to say, joke that 21 years his history was read, was a normal book, and on the 22nd year it became extremist. But this announcement, how to say, gave high popular for his book, and all who forgot this book, who didn't read it, began to search and read this book. The next, conceptual approaches have been defined within which one can conduct research and offer one's own interpretations. There was created concept of history of Belarus by historian Danilovich, whose career go up quickly, go up high in this last years. This concept was published previous project in 2019, but last year he announced this concept. It was, and we must work, write textbooks according, and scientific articles and dissertations according to this concept. The intention to bring all historians together is very old, but now it will be at the legislative level, and we are frightened now. Last month, so that will be carried, will be laws, and this laws will put historians in research, in references to the levels that excuse please, forgot a word, that регламентированы, that определены by the law. The next regulation of the issues of dissertation topics, also for students' works, master works, and another. Western Russianism has raised his head. A pantheon of national heroes, new pantheon or corrected pantheon is written now, and it will very soon will be introduced, and we would speak, write about historical actors, gave them marks according to this, also according to this list. The next, unification of Belarusian historical science with Russian science and inclusion of Russian narrative. And one of the last, termination of scientific ties with Western countries, but peripheral Russian universities invite us to their scientific events, conferences, and publications to publicate. And another. In these conditions, Belarusian historians that are in Belarus choose different strategies. I wrote 4 strategies, but it seems there are more there. First, those who received a ban on the profession, it is forbidden for them to participate in conference, to publish in the countries, and this group gave up, abandoned their scientific plans, and some of them changed their profession. The second group, in order to live a clear scientific conscience, they resigned, they resigned themselves, retired, And despite of all the restrictions and prohibitions, participation in conferences, publication, they individually conduct their scientific research. The next third group of historians that work within a certain research paradigm, harsh self-censorship, fear of referring to materials that are declared extremist, but they do this sincerely. They convey their thoughts in a veiled manner. The second group of historians became conscious guides of the prevailing methodological trends, permitted and interpretation. They are making a career. And here are three streams. The first, young careerists that in choosing dissertation topics interpretation to receive scientific levels. The second stream group, opportunities opened up in training through postdoctoral studies, defending doctoral dissertations, obtaining professional titles for these who in previous times or at all cannot do this, cannot receive, cannot write and defend. This is how those who repressed their colleges and students receive such opportunities. And see the third stream in this group, those historians who became propagandist guides of the official concept in the history of Belarus. The main known official historians in Belarus now are on this picture. This is Vadim Gigin and Igor Marozau, but their positions are very different. In context of unification of Belarusian science with Russian, such statement that Russian funds must support Gigin, but how to say, throw away or put in corner Marozau for his Polish how to say, Polish position, but his position is not Polish. He is he Belarusian position in these conditions. He spread but he is on the position of Western Russianism. The next, what are the problem areas in Belarusian science? The history of Belarusian statehood is a core topic. This direction was actualized by anniversary. 100 years of October Revolution, 100 years of BSSR, 100 years of USSR, 100 years of Riga Peace Treaty of 1921, 80 years of the reunification of Western Belarus with the BSSR, 1939. And in 2018-2020 was published 5-volume history of Belarusian statehood. It is on the left, this work. On the one hand, it spread concept. National or some say nationalist concept. On the other hand, the authors of this book are criticized by Western, by followers of Western Russianism. So the main topics, core topic of Belarusian history, historiography modern, as previous but especially modern, is the history of state, nation, and culture. Especially express is made on the state. On the right, this is a textbook wrote by a group of historians under the rule of Igor Marozau, and it is studies in the university. Here, this book take into account new trends that no, what are forbidden for us, but this is no at all is no normal book, and our symbol is published there. So many books were wrote and published devoted to Belarusian statehood, and we see here first two books to the 100 years to the of the Soviet power and the Soviet Union, so historical destiny of Belarusian Soviet statehood, Soviet experience, view from the 21st century. This book, one of devoted to supreme to the excuse please, Supreme Council of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic in 30s, 40s years. Then a group of books here, it is devoted to Belarusian statehood, western part of Belarusian territory in the context as part of Poland. So Riga peace agreement of 1921, and Belarus again about Riga peace in the destiny of Belarusian people. This book and documents Soviet and Western Belarus differentiated but joined. It is by its topic title is written, prepared as contra to this book, prepared by Belarusian historian that works now in Poland, Alexander Smolenchuk, liberated and зневоленные, not prisoned, but no, liberated, and those who lost freedom. And this book he wrote this book, he published this book to the day of to new holiday, the day of folk or people's unity that was announced in Belarus, and this day is devoted to the reunion of Western Eastern BSSR with Western Belarus in 1939. So much discussions and some books are devoted to this reunion, and this book always together to the 18th anniversary of this reunion of Western Belarus, service Western Belarus. About modern Belarusian statehood, the fifth volume of this many-volumed history on the Russian language. It is written. We all were surprised when Institute of History began to publish this book. Why in Russian language? But they answered to Russians orientated on Russian language. Belarusians can read and understand that we have their own history of statehood. This green book with green cover is the most, how to say, serious work on today's day, on modern day, in this list of books.
Can you finish in 2 minutes, Sviatlana, please?
I'm finishing. The 30 years of presidential power, such conferences and books appeared books devoted to history of joint state and this conference, these are materials of forum of joint state that prove that we all have a common destiny. Yes, our destiny was common last 2 centuries, but previous 5 or more centuries, it was different. About international relations, interesting books, international relations with countries, about which earlier, about relations earlier didn't wrote, Venezuela and China, and with countries that are now announced and unfriendly countries. One of the trends is research of historical memory. Conferences held, methodological recommendations are published, but all this memory, almost all this memory is devoted to the Second World War. Is one of these books, partisan parades and celebrations. Great Patriotic War and genocide, and about I'm finishing about a pantheon. In this pantheon how to say, Brest liquidator of Brest Church Union, Iosif Simashka, and Vilensky general governor Muravyev, but from this pantheon is thrown Tadeusz Kostyuszka and Kalinovsky. And this, I put the cover of this book, Belarus and Edward Vaynilovich, Interesting Destiny. Several years ago, Rome Catholic Church proposed and tried to announce Edward Vaynilovich, his economist, his leader of Minsk gentry, and he's the founder of Red Cathedral, Catholic Cathedral in Minsk, to announce him saint and power. Official signs supported conferences devoted to Vaynilovich, but situation changed. I will not speak about this slide. It shows what topics of dissertations are most, how to say, popular in now, last year's topics of dissertation defended in 2022-23. How to say in Russian or Belarusian, use Belarusian history of 19th century. And what about Russian institutions of power on the territory of Belarus, about post in Belarus, about prisons in Belarus, about social policy, confessional policy, and all in 19th, beginning of 20th century, because this is not dangerous topic for young, for young careerists. And these defended dissertations, some of them are reports from Russian reports from institutions of look like reports from Russian from institutions of power of Russian Empire. And the last, it is interesting that if to say about confessional history Belarus, though Greek Catholic or Uniate Church, it has negative mark in official historiography. Last years, several books, on my point of view, most books in confessional history are devoted by Greek Catholic Church, and two of them official. This in Institute of History wrote in his list of publication, and this Museum of Ancient Belarusian Art published this book. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Right, well, it doesn't seem we've heard from Siarhei, correct?
Article that he's
If to repeat, please.
Well, while we wait for him, the floor is open to questions and comments to the speakers.
we should ask Sviatlana to stop sharing the screen.
Can you stop sharing your screens? Yeah, well. Thank you. First question.
Sorry, who had their hand up?
Yeah.
Well, over here. Great. So your name and then your affiliation, please. Before you start. Yeah, at the end of this flyer.
I'm Pavel Charzov from the Skaryna library, one of the trustees. Yeah, I've got questions for David and Vital. So I'll start with David. To what extent do you think the Belarusian narrative is inspired or coordinated from Moscow? And do you think they will converge at some point, sort of Putin's narrative and Lukashenko's? Or is it entirely homegrown?
I see that Siarhei Marozau is already here. Excuse, please. I see that Siarhei Marozau is already here.
Yeah, maybe let's have 10 minutes maximum because we don't have that much time for lunch.
Okay, thank you for that. So do we want to do the question or should we do the presentation? Let's do the presentation. Okay, great. We'll do the presentation. You can charge then.
So, hey,
Only 10 minutes, please.
hello. But because we're running late, we only have 10 minutes. So could you keep your speech short? 10 minutes maximum, please.
Hello, it's for me 10 minutes, yes?
Yes, but 10 minutes maximum, please.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm sorry for delay. I will share my screen one moment. Yes. My theme is the Kremlin's shadow over the history of Belarusian memory of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in last 2 years. The vulnerability of Belarusian's historical policy is the reliance of its political elites and officials on Moscow in the issue of national identity since Soviet times. As Belarus' integration with Russia deepened in the 1990s, 2020s, the shadow of the Kremlin over Belarusian memory policy thickened. It received virtually unlimited potential for manipulation in this area. The Eastern European events of the 2020s have actualized as never before the problematization of the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. In 2022, when it became obvious that Belarus has no subjectivity for Russia, just like Ukraine, the issue of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became part of the geopolitical and civilizational choice of the future of Belarus, and two strategies emerged. Rapprochement with former allies in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Lublin Triangle, the idea of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania 2.0, the Three Seas initiative, and confrontation with them. Having understood the power of history, Minsk has been actively involved in the struggle on the historical field since the beginning of 2022, increasingly weaving the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania into its domestic and foreign policies. As propagandist Igor Tur noted, the government has missed out the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as a strong political argument in the hands of the opposition. Anyone interested in the period of Vitis is most likely an opponent of the government. In 2022, a new interpretation of the history of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was set, on which there was previously no clear official position. Scientists, educators, politicians, and experts were defined the following conceptualization approaches that must be followed. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania is a Belarusian state, the heritage of which was privatized by the Lithuanians and cannot be transferred to them only because of the name, and the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when the Belarusian language, culture, and religion were allegedly banned, should be referred in textbooks and museums as an occupation of Belarusian lands by Poles. The image of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as a strong and free state, which at one time successfully opposed the Moscow Principality, is inconvincing for both Minsk and Moscow, because it is necessary to promote the idea that these are fraternal peoples, not historical enemies. After 2020, the balance between historical narratives, Belarusian-centric and Western Russian, which had developed in the previous period of memory politics, was disrupted. The positions of supporters of Western Russianism with the idea that Belarus was historically destined to be a part of Russian civilization were strengthened. Since the end of 2022, the influence of the imperial Moscow-centric narrative, which is promoted in Belarus by Russia, has been growing. This concept was introduced in the official Belarusian narrative by the ideologist of the Russian world, philosopher Dugin, at his meeting with Lukashenko. The synchronization of the Belarusian memory policy with Russia is obvious. In the fall of 2022, the Russian-Belarusian conference was held in Polotsk, dedicated to the 215th anniversary of the first partition of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at which they actually celebrated that anniversary and tried to justify Russia's right to annex neighboring states through historical analogies. The strong influence of the integration process with Russia on the historical policy of Belarus was underscored by the installation in Minsk at the end of 2023 of a giant equestrian monument to the Russian commander Alexander Nevsky. In the Gomel region, the cult of Catherine II is being cultivated, who at one time annexed Belarus to Russia through the large-scale tourist program. Instead of Belarusian researchers and popularizers of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, who were forced out of their institutes and their homeland, the Russian world occupied their country, cultural and scientific space. At the beginning of the 2024, the joint Russian-Belarusian Commission on History was created. Its creation at the official level legitimized the activities of Russian actors in the political of memory in Belarus, and leads to the unification of Belarusian historical science with Russia. Russia is introducing its narrative about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, characters alien to Belarus into the internal Belarusian historical context, and idealizing historical events related to Russia. Now, the work of Belarusian historians must comply not only with their official ideology, but also with the demands of the Russian side. The infiltration of the Russian narrative is taking place in the government, education systems, science, culture, religion, and security forces. The suppression of the Belarus-centric narrative has given rise to the phenomenon of mnemonic resistance. The year 2021-2023 saw a real boom in the creation of new YouTube channels with historical content. The priority attention of a number of channels to the issue of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania testifies to the great cognitive and educational potential of this historical period. Since 2020, more than 62,000 of Belarusians have immigrated to Lithuania, which has led to an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment in the country. Public attempts have been made to provoke a split between Lithuanians and Belarusians based on their interpretation of the history of the heritage of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Often provocative actions are carried out in the interest of Minsk and Moscow, allegedly coming from the beavers of Litvinism. Usually this is graffiti in public places with the demand to return Vilnius. While Belarusians and Lithuanians argue about who owns what part of the Judean heritage, the Kremlin, with its plan to restore the empire, lays claim to the entire historical heritage of this state. Putin claims that the GDL was in fact a Russian principality. Now, a book was published in Moscow about the history of Lithuania, where the author prefers to its the head, where the Sergei Lavrov in the preface said that Lithuanian language and statehood are not exist, and they should be a part of Russia. So the ideas of book are similar to the rhetoric that accompanies Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The events of 2020 and especially 2022 in Eastern Europe have shown how important ancient history and its interpretations remain for post-communist societies. It can be a weapon of hybrid warfare and became a basis of unleashing a hot war. Since the end of the 2022, an active recolonization of the discourse of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the entire history of Belarus has been carried out through the synchronization of historical policy with Russia, which leads to the loss of the historical justification for the modern sovereignty of Belarus. Thank you. 10 minutes.
Thank you for keeping to 10 minutes a day. I'm sure we can add a little time, maybe 5 minutes at least, to Q&A period. We had one question for David, which I hope he remembers, but we'll just start collecting one more. Have a bet.
So I'm Alex again from King's College, and I have a question for Vital and for Professor Marples. So I kind of following up on what Pavel had asked. I'm wondering if you see this discussion and the use of the term genocide as solely a product of 2020, or kind of dovetailing also with these other discussions that Dirk Moses critiques, right, using permanent security versus genocide. So I'm wondering if it's kind of the 2020 as well as these global kind of politicized uses of the term genocide or if it's mostly this 2020 and how you kind of see that with the uses of the term genocide. And then for Pavel, I really liked how you said, I think, Belarusian conquistadores, but that implies a very kind of religious aspect to colonization, which to my limited understanding was not a feature of Russian imperial colonization, but maybe I'm wrong. So I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that, if there were other reasons beyond economic motivations. And also, I'm wondering if the sources you were able to find, I'm wondering what these Belarusians, explorers, conquerors thought of the places that they were also encountering. So thank you very much for both of your talks.
Okay, so we'll take answers to those two questions. David, I noticed that you called Dukov a prolific propagandist. So he's obviously been directly involved with the kind of political technology historian. So how much of the organizational effort in this new history is Russian or kind of joint enterprise, as it were?
Okay, and that kind of coincides with your question as well. Yeah. Well, I think initially Belarus had its own interpretations, but more recently, we've seen much more Russian influence than before. It doesn't mean it's exactly the same. I mean, there are still certain differences. I think Belarus has the partisans, which is something exclusive to Belarus, and they're definitely exploiting that as far as possible. But I do see it being more integrated with Russia, and certainly, you know, the idea of Belarusianization, as I mentioned, has been completely dropped now from the national narratives. And on the question about genocide, actually in the paper itself, I go into that in more detail, and I do compare it with the use of the term for the Holodomor in Ukraine, and how it's based on, you know, the 1948 UN interpretation of genocide, which actually is quite narrow. Sorry, it's actually quite broad. It admits political victims of genocide, but apart from that, it does say that it could be simply part of a group or a part of a nation or whatever. So it's a very broad interpretation, and I think it's been exploited in Belarus in just the same way that it's been applied very generally. It wouldn't mean that the intention was to eliminate every Belarusian under occupation. That could not possibly be the case. But yeah, I agree with you. It's taken part of the more wider usage and politicized usage that we see today.
Thank you, David. Vital, a question for you?
Yeah, thank you for these aspects of this phenomena. The first one, as far as I understand, a religious aspect of these Belarusian conquistadores in the conquest of Siberia. Generally, in many colonial projects, religion was kind of ideological motivation, but it was a problem for colonizers. Because if these subjects, slaves, or indigenous people are Christianized, they are under protection of the royal authorities in this other manner. And often it was a contradiction between the church and between those agents of colonization who exploited it economically. The same was in West Indies, where slaves were often not baptized. The same was in Siberia, because those who were like Orthodox, like indigenous people, they should be treated differently as those tribute payers who are pagans. And the same thing is interesting for the very colonizers, because a large part of these colonizers were prisoners of war who were offered to join service, and Orthodoxy was not a demand. So there were Catholics from Poland, Lithuania, or even Lutherans, Germans, who still stayed in their faith. Only if they wanted to really integrate and make careers, then they converted. So religious motivation, despite very important in the metropole of Moscow, the same as metropolis of Spain, England, and so on, in colonies often worked from this pragmatical point of view. And for example, Tsar or government even discourage conversion of indigenous people to Christianity, not to lose these tribute payers. It's if to be brief. Second one is a far understood approach of these Belarusian colonizers to local people. Actually, it's still a very important, interesting issue for me. There is no really good detailed studies on this aspect. Often it is idealized in this Soviet mainstream of friendship of people, like Belarusians come to develop Siberia, and they were not like these evil colonizers, they were friendly to people. However, there are interesting observations I had. For example, those people vanished to Siberia in 19th century. They were pretty critical to Russian government. And on these terms, they were sometimes pretty sympathetic to indigenous people struggling against this Russian oppression. I guess it was even one guy from Belarus in 18th century banished got confederate to Kamchatka, and he called the Chukchis like Cherkessians of the north, because he really respected their stubborn resistance. The same happened, for example, in Heishi to a certain extent. However, this sympathetic approach in these sources did not reflect some activity like refusal to oppress these people or not to subjugate them to Russia or not to extract these resources. And I guess this current Belarusian vision of themselves as a better, even while in Germany, Belarusians feel better immigrants than these non-white immigrants. It is still a result of this history of sub-imperialism.
Thank you. Other question? One online. We'll take a minute and then the question online.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Marples. I'm Alexandra Muzikantova from British Embassy in Minsk. So do you reckon there is any good fitting term instead of genocide to be used for the civil losses, the losses among the civil population in Belarus during the occupation, or should we just call it that? Thank you.
We'll pick up the second book. We'll let David answer.
Yeah, it's a good question, because obviously it was a huge loss of population, and it included the Holocaust of the Jewish population, which probably made up about a third of all the total losses, and which is used. I have no alternative term myself. I don't know what you would call it, massacre or, but I don't agree that you could use the term genocide in the same way that you could use it about the Jewish population. I think that's really the difference between them, that the Slavs were regarded as clearly as inferior and to be treated absolutely cruelly as prisoners of war, for example, or forced labor, but not necessarily to be physically eliminated upon sight. And I think, unless, of course, they were members of the Communist Party, and I think that's probably the difference. I'm glad to hear the British Embassy is still open in Minsk, is it?
We had a question online from one of our speakers earlier. Sandor, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can now, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So my question is addressed to Sviatlana Marozava, that that Professor Marozava and me too lived already in the time of the Soviet Union. So how can you compare the recent populist, nationalist oppression of the freedom of science and the Stalinist Soviet Bolshevik oppression of the academic freedom? So in the Stalinist times, and in communist times in East Europe, we can publish some papers with a lot of quotation from Lenin, Marx, and Engels, but in the body text, we can publish something scientific issue. So you may remember that you may understand because you have experience in Soviet times and nowadays. So what is the difference in typology of the recent nationalist Lukashenko-like oppression of the academic freedom and Soviet oppression of freedom?
Maybe I didn't understand the whole sense of your question, but the main freedom, as my colleagues say, in difference with 1937, that now are not shooted all the same, but also not shooted us. Arrest, fired, forbid, but not shooted. It seems that in the Soviet Union was not freedom for publication of national or nationalist works of nationalist character. It was Soviet, Russian Soviet point of view. And now I said that this national concept is limited not only by powers, but by international policy, the policy of integration with Russia.
Okay, thank you, Sviatlana. We have time for a couple more questions. At the back.
Yeah, I have a question to David. You mentioned, oh, I'm Olga Solovyova from University, Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun. You mentioned that the numbers changed on many crimes, and you said there were no sources added, or there was no justification in any kind of archival research. And I wonder, what is your interpretation of this? Is it like these numbers were taken randomly, just out of imagination, or there was some kind of pseudo archival work led, or were there additional sources added, or additional, whether they did provide some kind of justification? Yeah, because it's natural to ask, okay, where these numbers come from, or they conducted campaigns of reevaluation of the previous data, or it was just journalistically we announced that it was this number. That's it.
Well, I've not personally got a copy of Shved's book, which may contain information that I don't know, but I've never seen any sources cited. And the question that intrigued me was, where did all these corpses come from? Like if you suddenly uncover dead bodies or bones in a gravesite, where did they come from? And last time I was doing research in Belarus, which was actually before 2020, in 2019, I visited 3 different burial sites of people who've been executed by the NKVD during Stalin's time. And I suspect that these are the bodies that are being uncovered and now being blamed on the Nazis, but I don't know for sure. But that would seem to me the most likely source of finding bodies, because they know where they are. I mean, they're all close to major cities, and there's about 12 different sites in the city of Minsk itself. And they knew where to look, obviously. So that's what I think, but I have no evidence, so I didn't bring it up in the talk. It's just merely a suspicion, but I do think the numbers are fairly random. I think they just simply raise the numbers, which change every time. I mean, then from one report to the next, they're always different.
May I add to this question a bit? I have a bit of clue. This might be interesting for David and for the audience. May I?
Yes.
If briefly, as I see it from my native Swiss district, as it was done, these huge data came from after-war, post-war evaluations. After the reoccupation, it was some commissions working, and they write these reports in pretty broad manner with pretty broad numbers about victims, losses, and so on. Later, as I see, they were clarified by Soviet scholars, by Soviet commissions, but these fantastic numbers, I guess, at least in the case of Nesvish, came from these very fast evaluations. Probably these prosecutors, who are not historians, just took these protocols, put them together, and they got this horrible number of destructions. Probably, as I see, maybe it can be projected wide.
Okay, a little later than advertised, we'll break for lunch.
Thanks, Vito.